Well, hi there, it's Polly here in the glorious outdoors with Mr. Snoots. And so I want to share some more transgender history with you. I'll be speaking about trans women, again, not to belittle the experience of transgender men, but just as a story about the transgender female community. And it's a very important one, and it's one about some women that we owe just everything to. And it takes place in the hot summer of August 1966 in San Francisco. Now, you've all heard of the Stonewall Riots, and this is hailed as the moment when the gay rights movement took off and so on. So, not true. And for the transgender community, there are many myths in Stonewall about who threw bricks and who whatever. There are no questions and no ambiguities in the little story I'm going to tell you now. And that is the riot at Compton's. So, in San Francisco in the 60s, there was a gay, lesbian, and transgender population. Now, at that stage, transgenderism was referred to as transvestitism because essentially we hadn't really thought about terms that well and that completely. But the Tenderloin district is a section of San Francisco, and back then it was essentially a vice-riddled district. If you look up the definition of Tenderloin as a district, it is a term, and a Tenderloin district is an area that is under the control of corrupt authorities or corrupt police. That's the dictionary definition. It is also a ghetto. The dictionary definition of a ghetto is a place where impoverished minorities cluster due to either being legally or socially forced into those areas, e.g. like Jewish ghettos under the Nazis, or socially forced there due to this being the only housing available. Or, due to it being a Tenderloin district, it's the only place where their lifestyles are available. So in the 60s there was a sizable population of transgender women there. And there were essentially two different streams. Now, none of these could get what you would be thinking of as legitimate work. At the upper end, there were the performers in various clubs. These are dancers and singers and comedians, and they are the pretty ones. They are the accomplished ones. They have often, some education to get where they are. But they're also just the sex workers on the streets. Now, how these people have come about to be sex workers is because they could not get other jobs. These women could not get jobs because of their identity as transvestites. They were simply not allowed to hire on anywhere in their female form, but if they tried presenting male, they were too sissy and would simply be fired. Also, because they were transgender, many of them were denied the actual IDs required to get jobs and to get onto any kind of social programming, which in fact didn't exist. More of that later. So there was nothing left for them but sex work, and this is what they did. But they conceived of themselves as women, and that is pretty clear from the start. Yep, they wanted the Tenderloin, they had their patches, they did sex work, but they wanted areas to socialise, and socialise as women. And the place that was the selected spot to go was Jean Compton's cafe. It was situated on a corner, sandwiched between some gay bathhouses and on a street which had a row of the clubs at which transgender women were performing. And this was a place where you could just sit and, have a donut and a cup of coffee or get a meal, and they would chat and they would talk. The bathrooms there was a place where transgender women went, literally to pee, but also to touch up their makeup. And often this was also a place where fledgling transgender people would turn up in order to, literally get their first makeup on, try their first dress on. They could step out there and find nothing but approval from the people all around them, and suddenly they sort of had a place to be. So it was very important to that community. Compton's was not really in a position to be happy or unhappy. It's in the sodding tenderloin. This is your clientele. However, the place was regularly raided by police. Now, living in the tenderloin, the women there are subject to constant and brutal police harassment. Dressing outside of your, assigned gender is a crime for which the police will get you. They will get you almost at whim. Many police had individuals that they just simply hated, and they were in a position of power to push it. Many would harass people in the hope of payout because the police culture there was so corrupt, and sometimes that payout was also in form of sex. Yes, they've always hated us but also desired us. Now, the other thing they'll get you for is obstructing the sidewalk, because that's a very vague term. Arrested women were usually beaten, usually thrown into jail, and the police would want to shave their heads. Women who forcibly resisted having their heads shaved would be thrown into solitary confinement without charge or trial for 60 days. So, completely unconstitutional as well as illegal. God, I hate police. So this is the life that they were living. And then some things happened. And, oh dear, they happened in a slow and steady progression, and they changed everything. So, one of the things that happened was the Vietnam War. So there was a protest movement beginning, and a protest movement that began to show that civil action was a thing. People could actually protest and actually get things done. With this came a concept of counterculture that maybe the old ways were not solid. Now, first and second wave feminism were incredibly hostile to transgender people, as indeed third and fourth wave feminism are now. But the emergent feminism of that time was starting to look at a clearer idea that gender norms are used by the patriarchy to reinforce itself. Okay, so into this they came a couple of things. The US government at the time suddenly declared a war on poverty, and they opened some programs for the poor. This was opportunities to get education from the federal government. These were opportunities to do training and so forth, and actually lift yourself up out of poverty. But none of these women had access to it because they did not have the documents that allowed them to access it. They were trans people. Outside of society, no documentation. So they were stuck. However, the civil rights fights were going on at the time. There was a church in the area, and one of the preachers from the south, a black preacher, came over, and he took over that church. And they began to look into social issues and how to help these trans women. This church was it was funded off a private endowment. So it was able to do what it damn well wanted without having to bow to the strictures of any sort of upper controls. So it began to reach out to the community, and it began to actually give these women places to go. It began looking after people's health. But it also began to talk about rights and the fight for rights. And these preachers hit the streets and people were listening. And then there came a group called Vanguard. Now, Vanguard was actually a gay organisation, and let's be clear, transgender people have usually been shut outside of the gay rights community through all of its early years, and indeed are often largely shut out now. We are blacklisted, banned, or definitely pushed to the back of many pride parades to this day. But Vanguard was there to fight the fight. They put out a magazine and it just said, "We protest, we protest, we protest." Now, wackily enough, Vanguard was actually founded by essentially a rogue Mormon priest who left Mormonism and set up this group for rights. They put out a magazine, they had political meetings, they got together, they were doing on-the-ground action, caring for homeless transgender people, getting people housing and so on. But they were talking to them and they were putting out magazines. And the core of that was that all men are created equal. All humans are created equal. And they have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, that myth that America pretends to run by. But this was inspiring. And Vanguard, as its headquarters, chose to meet at Compton's. So the women coming in to Compton's to sit and talk and discuss are now there with not only preachers from this church and people from Vanguard, but they're also mingling with, old and new trans folk. And a message is starting to come through, and it's vital for us that we have an identity. That being a trans woman is actually a thing that is not a mental illness, it is actually an identity. And that identities are worth fighting for. There is no freedom unless you have the freedom to express yourself and live your chosen life. No other freedoms count if you do not have those. And as they sat there and they looked and they realised they were a community, the transgender inhabitants of an area suddenly decided they were a community. They had always looked out for each other, but now they had an ID, and this is radical. Yes, we've had sort of transgender people in Berlin and so on earlier, and I will cover that, but these people were tight. Suddenly they're a thing. And then a transgender woman decided to go into the bathroom, and a policeman who hated her decided to go in there and drag her out. And one of the other trans women threw hot coffee in the guy's face. Now, transgender women then, and I honestly suggest now, would carry drinks in their handbags. Back then what they would do is they would take a Southern Comfort bottle. You've probably seen them, they're a case bottle. And if they didn't have alcohol in them, they would just fill them with water, and that just goes in your purse. Why? Because you can swing it with immense force and you can literally break someone's skull with it. from personal experience, I can tell you, get a metal water bottle, a litre water bottle, and carry it in your shoulder bag at all times. I'm not joking, it saved my life. Police in that region, or everywhere in fact, had this saying, the club trumps all. When in doubt, they're just going to beat people up with clubs. Police came thundering into the cafe, and they had, in the words of my Australian people, the living shit beaten out of them by transgender women wielding their handbags. They knocked police out, smashed the windows, set fire to the squad car that had come up to deal with the whole thing. The newsstand, which had always given the women trouble, that was set on fire as well. It was a whole riot. Police did turn up and they dragged some of these women away, and they were actually triumphant about it because it was the first time a trans community had stood up to the police and actually done something together, and they won. The next day they turned up and they picketed Compton's because Compton's wasn't allowing anyone back in. And Compton's said that the reason they weren't going to let anyone in is they didn't like the uppity attitude of the trans community anymore now that they've been hanging out with the Vanguard people and these damn preachers. So they just blocked out the thing. They called the police and the riot started again. And it was a victory. They actually smashed in the newly replaced windows of Compton's, pretty much shut it down. And the police actually retreated. There were several immediate responses to this. Pardon me while I just check his name. I want to make sure I have it because he is a hero. Elliot Blackstone. Okay, so into this mix comes a new policeman on the beat, Elliot Blackstone. And he's just come in and he's seen what's going on. And after this riot, everything is different. The trans women are not hiding anymore. They are walking into stores and they are trying on dresses. You know, they're not hiding anywhere, they're not creeping out the back, not pretending not to be looking at the dresses. They are window shopping, they're getting out there and they're trying them on in the change rooms. They are walking into perfume shops. They are buying lingerie out where everyone can see. They are living entirely as women, and screw anybody that dares to try and stop them. This policeman decided, wackily enough, to start trying to understand this community because no one knew anything about this. So this guy got every single book on transgenderism that he could find. He went, through all of the sexologists. He actually diligently read up on this, and he realized that they can't interact with this community the way they have been, that they actually have a right to do this. They have a constitutional right to live their lives. So he began trying to work with them. Now, they couldn't figure him out initially, but in the end, the guy ended up being a much beloved local hero because he kept the police off their backs, and there was no going back. The policemen started dragging women off the streets now for obstructing the sidewalk. 7 or 8 women are going to come over and beat the living snot out of you. So if you're going to harass a woman, bring 3 or 4 squad cars and be sure that one of them's going to be on fire by the end of this confrontation. It became a no-go zone for police. God bless it, thanks to those women. A couple of things were immediate results following after this. One was Stanford opened up a sex change clinic, and there were funding avenues open. So these women, those who wanted surgeries to change, finally had a door open that would allow it because it was just unreachable. This is something you had to go to fly to Denmark for and spend tens of thousands of dollars on. But now you can just get it at Stanford in San Francisco. The other thing was the psychiatric departments at the universities there and at the clinics would give you a certificate which said, you are a transsexual. We have spoken to this person, they are a transsexual. And this, unfortunately, it was still listing us as a medical condition, but it said this person has an identity, which means suddenly they've got an ID, which allows them to get access to these war and poverty programs. They could get education and skills training. And that's when everything changed. These women, in later years, they went out. Some of them became secretaries after getting secretary training, but those secretaries moved on to run businesses, become business leaders. Some became teachers and educators. Some became sex educators. Many became activists. Many went on to become top-line entertainers. But they spread out into the world, and they lived rich lives and they lived valuable lives, and every single one of those lives said they were proud to be a transgender woman. Many of them were foundation members of transgender rights movements across the USA. I am so proud of those women, and we owe them everything, because this was the first time in the USA that they stood up. Another result from this was the National Transgender Unified Council, which is the first advocacy and aid group run by transgender people for transgender people. Housing, education, health, political advocacy, run by us, for us. That was the other direct result from this. Never again would the transgender community lose sight of the fact that we are a community and we are an identity. This was it, and this is what they gave us. Elliot Blackstone, he helped as best he could. He'd only been on the beat a couple of years when his enemies in the force decided to get rid of him by planting narcotics in his desk and forcing him out of the department. He remained a key figure and key organiser of the Pride parades in San Francisco, and was one of the few straight men marching in the Pride parades. A beloved figure, much heroised. He passed on somewhere in the 90s and was mourned by a community that had come to realise who he was and how much they loved him. Transgender feminism, transfeminism, spread and became a thing. Transgender people began working in the music industry and began to rebut the efforts of feminism to shut us out. We were a thing at last. San Francisco remained, and indeed remains, a centre of sort of gay presence and culture in the USA. Homosexuality was decriminalised there relatively early on. It was not until 1995 they passed a law decriminalising transgenderism. This is our heritage. The fight that those people made and their realisation that they were a community is vital. Never lose sight of that. Never forget that in 1966, some women got together and said, all people are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Never forget that. Stand up, be seen, fight for your rights, be unafraid. If they could do it in 1966, you can do it today. Look after yourselves out there. Mr. Snoots and I are carrying on the fight, and I will see you guys sometime, I hope. Stay safe. Much love to everybody.